Hi guys, let's start part number 2 of chapter 1, that is the French Revolution. So, scepter, symbol of royal power. Snake biting its tail to form a ring. So, snake biting its tail to form a ring, symbol of eternity. A ring has neither beginning nor end. Then we have red Phrygian cape. So, red Phrygian cap. So, cap worn by a slave upon becoming free. Then we have blue, white, red. Blue, white, red, the national colors of France. The winged women. The winged women, personification of the law. The law tablet. The law tablet. The law is the same for all, and all are equal before it. So, number 3, that is France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. The situation in France continued to be tense during the following years. Although Louis XVI had signed the constitution, he entered into secret negotiations with the King of Prussia. So he got into a secret negotiations with the King of Prussia. Rulers of other neighboring countries too were worried by the developments in France and made plans to send troops to put down the events that had been taking place there since the summer of 1789. Before this could happen, the National Assembly voted in April 1792 to declare war against Prussia and Austria. Thousands of volunteers thronged from the provinces to join the army. They saw this as a war of the people against kings and aristocracies all over Europe. Among the patriotic songs they sang was the Marseillaise, composed by the poet Roger de Lisle. It was sung for the first time by volunteers from Marseilles as they marched into Paris, and so got its name. The Marseillaise is now the national anthem of France. The Revolutionary Wars brought losses and economic difficulties to the people, while the men were away fighting at the front. So while the men were away fighting at the front, women were left to cope with the task of earning a living and looking after their families. Large sections of the population were convinced that the revolution had to be carried further, as the Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer sections of society. Political clubs became an important rallying point for people who wished to discuss government policies and plan their own forms of action. The most successful of these clubs was that of the Jacobins, which got its name from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Women too, who had been active throughout this period, formed their own clubs. Section 4 of this chapter will tell you more about their activities and demands. The members of the Jacobin Club belonged mainly to the less prosperous sections of society. So they belonged to the less prosperous sections. They included small Shopkeepers, artisans such as shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, as well as servants and daily wage workers. Their leader was Maximilian Robespierre. A large group among the Jacobins decided to start wearing long striped trousers similar to those worn by dock workers. This was to set themselves apart from the fashionable sections of society, especially nobles who wore knee breeches. So, figure number 9, a Sun Culotte couple. So, figure number 9 is a Sun Culotte couple. So, what is the meaning of convent? Building belonging to a community devoted to a religious life. Then we have figure 10. Nanin Valen, Liberty. This is one of the rare paintings by a women artist. The revolutionary events made it possible for women to train with established painters and to exhibit their works in the Salon, which was an exhibition held every 2 years. The painting is a female allegory of liberty. That is, the female form symbolizes the idea of freedom. So figure number 10, Nanin Valen, Liberty. This is one of the rare paintings by a women artist. The revolutionary events made it possible for women to train with established painters and to exhibit their work in the Salon, which was an exhibition held every 2 years. The painting is a female allegory of liberty. That is, the female form symbolizes the idea of freedom. The female form symbolizes the idea of freedom. Okay. It was a way of proclaiming the end of the power wielded by the wearers of knee breeches. These Jacobins came to be known as the Sun Culotte, literally meaning those without knee breeches. Sun Culotte men wore in addition the red cap that symbolizes liberty. Women, however, were not allowed to do so. So in this figure that we have seen, a Sun Culotte couple, so he wears a cap. Okay, this is the one, and women doesn't wear a cap. So in the summer of 1792, the Jacobins planned an insurrection of a large number of Parisians who were angered by the short supplies and high prices of food. On the morning of August 10, they stormed the palace of the Tuileries, massacred the king's guards, and held the king himself as hostage for several hours. Later, the assembly voted to imprison the royal family. So they imprisoned the royal family. Elections were held. From now on, all men of 21 years and above, regardless of wealth, got the right to vote. The newly elected assembly was called the Convention. On 21st September 1792. So on 21st September 1792, it abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. As you know, a republic is a form of government where the people elect the government, including the head of the government. There is no hereditary monarchy. You can try and find out about some of other countries. You can try and find out about some other countries that are republics and investigate when and how they became so. Then Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. So we have a new word, treason, betrayal of one's country or government. On 21st January 1793, he was executed publicly. So he was executed publicly. So he was executed publicly at the Place de la Concorde. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, met with the same fate shortly after. So she also was executed. Then the Reign of Terror. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. All of those whom he saw as being enemies of the Republic, that is, ex-nobles and clergy, members of the other political parties, even members of his own party who did not agree with his methods, were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal. If the court found them guilty, they were guillotined. The guillotine is a device. So the guillotine is a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. It was named after Dr. Guillotine, who invented it. Robespierre's government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Meat and bread were rationed. Peasants were forced to transport their grain to the cities and sell it at prices fixed by the government. The use of more expensive white flour was forbidden. All citizens were required to eat the plain d'égalité, that is equality bread. So it's called pain d'égalité, a loaf made of whole wheat. Equality was also sought to be practiced through forms of speech and address. Instead of the traditional monsieur, that is sir and madame, all French men and women were henceforth citoyen, and citoyen, that is citizen. Churches were shut down and their buildings converted into barracks or offices. So we have a source. What is liberty? Two conflicting views. The revolutionary journalist Camille Desmoulins wrote the following in 1793. He was executed shortly after during the Reign of Terror. Some people believe that liberty is like a child, which needs to get through a phase of being disciplined before it attains maturity. Quite the opposite. Liberty is happiness, reason, equality, justice. It is the declaration of rights. You would like to finish off all your enemies by guillotining them. Has anyone heard of something more senseless? Would it be possible to bring a single person to the scaffold without making 10 more enemies among his relations and friends? On 7th February 1794, Robespierre made a speech at the convention, which was then carried by the newspaper Le Moniteur Universel. Here is an extract from it. To establish and consolidate democracy, to achieve the peaceful rule of constitutional laws, we must first finish the war of liberty against tyranny. We must annihilate the enemies of the Republic at home and abroad, or else we shall perish. In time of revolution, a democratic government may rely on terror. Terror is nothing but justice, swift, severe, and inflexible, and is used to meet the most urgent needs of the fatherland. To curb the enemies of liberty through terror is the right of the founder of the Republic. Robespierre pursued his policies so relentlessly that even his supporters began to demand moderation. Finally, he was convicted by a court in July 1794, arrested, on the next day sent to the guillotine. So what he did to others, he got the same thing. Here is a figure. Figure 11. The revolutionary government sought to mobilize the loyalty of its subjects through various means. One of them was the staging of festivals like this one. Symbols from civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome were used to convey the aura of a hallowed history. The pavilion on the raised platform in the middle, carried by classical columns, was made of perishable material that could be dismantled. Describe the groups of people, their clothes, their roles and actions. What impression of a revolutionary festival does this image convey? A Directory rules France. The fall of the Jacobin government. So, the Jacobin government fall. The fall of the Jacobin government allowed the wealthier middle classes to seize power. A new constitution was introduced which denied the vote to non-propertied sections of society. So it again denied the vote to non-propertied sections of society. It provided for 2 elected legislative councils. These then appointed a directory, an executive made up of 5 members. This was meant as a safeguard against the concentration of power in a one-man executive as under the Jacobins. However, the directors often clashed with the legislative councils, who then sought to dismiss them. The political instability of the Directory paved the way for the rise of a military dictator, that is Napoleon Bonaparte. Through all these changes in the form of government, the ideals of freedom, of equality before the law, and of fraternity remained inspiring ideals that motivated political movements in France and the rest of Europe during the following century. Did women have a revolution? So, let's see. Figure 12. Parisian women on their way to Versailles. This print is one of the many pictorial representations of the events of 5th October 1789, when women marched to Versailles and brought the king back with them to Paris. From the very beginning, women were active participants in the events which brought about so many important changes in French society. They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. Most women of the Third Estate had to work for a living. So, most women of the Third Estate had to work for a living. They worked as seamstresses or laundresses, sold flowers, fruits, vegetables at the market, or were employed as domestic servants in the houses of prosperous people. Most women did not have access to education or job training. Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the Third Estate could study at a convent, after which their families arranged a marriage for them. Working women had also to care for their family, that is, cook, fetch water, queue up for bread, and look after the children. Their wages were lower than those of men. In order to discuss and voice their interest, women started their own political club and newspapers. After 60 women's clubs, about 60 women's clubs came up in different French cities. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women. So the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous of them. One of their main demands was that women enjoy the same political rights as men. Women enjoy the same political rights as men. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced them to passive citizens. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly, and to hold political office. Only then, they felt, would their interest be represented in the new government. In the early years, the revolutionary government did introduce laws and helped improve the lives of women. Together with the creation of state schools, schooling was made compulsory. Together with the creation of state schools, schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Their fathers could no longer force them into marriage against their will. Marriage was made into a contract, entered into freely, and registered under civil law. Divorce was made legal and could be applied for by both women and men. Women could now train for jobs, could become artists, or run small businesses. Women's struggle for equal political rights, however, continued. During the Reign of Terror, the new government issued laws ordering closure of women's clubs and banning their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of them executed. Women's movements for voting rights and equal wages continued. So they were not given voting rights and equal wages. So it continued through the next 200 years in many countries of the world. The fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th, that is 1800, and early 20th centuries, that is 1900s. The example of the political activities of French women during the revolutionary years was kept alive as an inspiring memory. It was finally in 1946 that women in France won the right to vote. The life of a revolutionary woman. Olympe de Gouges, 1748 to 1793. Olympe de Gouges was one of the most important of the politically active women in revolutionary France. She protested against the Constitution and the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen as they excluded women from basic rights that each human being was entitled to. So in 1791 she wrote a Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen, which she addressed to the Queen and to the members of the National Assembly, demanding that they act upon it. In 1793, Olympe de Gouges criticized the Jacobin government for forcibly closing down women's clubs. She was tried by the National Convention, which charged her with treason. Soon after this, she was executed. Source F. Some of the basic rights set forth in Olympe de Gouges' declaration. Number 1. Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights. Number 2. The goal of all political associations is the preservation of the natural rights of women and men. These rights are liberty, property, security, and above all, resistance to oppression. Number 3. The source of all sovereignty resides in the nation, which is nothing but the union of women and men. The law should be the expression of the general will. All women and men all female. Number 4. The law should be the expression of the general will. All female and male citizens should have a say either personally or by their representatives in its formulation. It should be the same for all. All female and male citizens are equally entitled to all honors and public employment according to their abilities and without any other distinction than that of their talents. Number 5. No woman is an exception. She is accused, arrested, and detained in cases determined by law. Women, like men, obey this rigorous law. Then we have figure 13, women queuing up at the bakery. Source G. In 1793, the Jacobin politician Jomet sought to justify the closure of women's clubs on the following grounds. Has nature entrusted domestic duties to men? Has she given us breast to nurture babies? No, she said to men, be a man, hunting, agriculture, political duties, that is your kingdom. She said to women, be a woman, the things of the household, the sweet duties of motherhood, those are your task. Shameless are those women who wish to become men. Have not duties been fairly distributed? Number 5. The abolition of slavery. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. The colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and San Domingo, were important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. But the reluctance of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands meant a shortage of labor on the plantations. So this was met by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast, where they bought slaves from local chieftains. Branded and shackled, the slaves were packed tightly into ships for the 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. There they were sold to plantation owners. The exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. Figure 14. The Emancipation of Slaves. This print of 1794 describes the emancipation of slaves. The tricolor banner on top carries the slogan, "The Rights of Man." The inscription below reads, "The freedom of the unfree." A French woman appears to civilize the African and American Indian slaves by giving them European clothes to wear. Throughout the 18th century, there was little criticism of slavery in France. The National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of men should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies, but it did not pass any laws, fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade. It was finally the convention which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions. This, however, turned out to be a short-term measure. 10 years later, Napoleon reintroduced slavery. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interest. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in 1848. So, Negroes, a term used for the indigenous people of Africa south of the Sahara. It is a derogatory term not in common use any longer. So, emancipation, the act of freeing. The revolution and everyday life. Can politics change the clothes people wear, the language they speak, or the books they read? The years following 1789 in France saw many such changes in the lives of men, women, and children. The revolutionary governments took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice. One important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille, in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. In the old regime, all written material and cultural activities, that is, books, newspapers, plays, could be published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. Now that the Declaration of the Rights Now the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. So now the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures flooded the towns of France from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside. They all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. Each side sought to convince the others of its position through the medium of print. Plays, songs, and festive processions attracted large numbers of people. This was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in texts which only a handful of educated people could read. So the freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. Each side sought to convince the others of its position through the medium of print. Plays, songs, and festive processions attracted large numbers of people. This was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in texts which only a handful of educated people could read. So, figure 15, the patriotic fat reducing press. This anonymous print of 1796 seeks to make the idea of justice tangible. So we have another picture. Figure 16. Marat addressing the people. This is a painting by Louis Leopold Boilly. Recall what you have learnt about Marat in this chapter. Describe the scene around him. Account for his great popularity. What kinds of reactions would a painting like this produce among viewers in the salon? So let's come to the conclusion. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. He set out to conquer neighboring European countries, dispossessing dynasties and creating kingdoms where he placed members of his family. Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people, but soon Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. He was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Many of his measures that carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe had an impact on people long after Napoleon had left. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important. So the ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. These spread from France to the rest of Europe. During the 19th century, where feudal systems were abolished. So figure 17, this figure, it is a picture of Napoleon crossing the Alps, painted by David. Colonized people reworked the idea of freedom from bondage into their movements to create a sovereign nation-state. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy are two examples of individuals who responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. Okay. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was one of those who was inspired by new ideas that were spreading through Europe at that time. The French Revolution and later the July Revolution excited his imagination. He could think and talk of nothing else when he heard of the July Revolution in France in 1830. On his way to England at Cape Town, he insisted on visiting frigates, that is, warships, flying the revolutionary tricolour flag, though he had been temporarily lamed by an accident. So these are the activities and questions. Okay, so that's all guys. See you in my next video. Bye.